Hi, this is a slideshow I made using Prezi and QuickTime, and it analyzes the Qing dynasty in China. It analyzes Jerry Bentley's view of the Qing dynasty, the Columbia website's view of the Qing dynasty, and it also analyzes the Southern Inspection Scrolls and how the Qing and the US are similar and different. Jerry Bentley, author of Traditions and Encounters, it's pictured over here, emphasizes that the Chinese had support for the Qing even though they were Manchurian, and this is kind of contradictory to usual Chinese tradition because they saw themselves as the Middle Kingdom and better than any foreigners. But apparently the Manchurians were similar enough and good enough that they liked them. However, the Manchurians actually wanted to keep their cultural identity, so they banned Chinese from learning the native language and banned them from marrying Manchurians, and also forced Chinese males to grow a Manchu-style queue, which is this kind of haircut. And that was actually a way to show their subordinacy. Bentley likes the Qing Emperor Kangxi and speaks of him admirably. He states his support for Confucian education, his love of poetry and reading, and also his success in conquering nearby lands. He also likes Qianlong, but is a little more critical of the end of his rule. He states Qianlong's success as a conqueror, his scholarship, and his thriving economy. In fact, he even canceled taxes occasionally. But at the end of Qianlong's reign, he actually put a lot of work on the eunuchs, and he started to live a little more luxuriously. It wasn't a problem in his rule, and it didn't cause much criticism at the time, but it set a precedent that lasted, and that became a problem. Bentley liked the civil service system, and this was a system in which there was test taking, it was a meritocracy, and it caused, smart scholars to be in high government jobs. And that was brought back by the Qing, so he's very complimentary about that, and also seems to be okay with the way global trade was during the time. There was a market for global trade in China during the time, but he's critical of the lack of technological growth in China during Qing times. But on the whole, it seems like Bentley is complimentary of the dynasty, but or at least the early parts of it. He has his few little quibbles with it, but seems to like it. The Columbia website, on the other hand, is very complimentary and has almost nothing bad to say about the dynasty. It states how Kangxi and Qianlong supported art, particularly admiring the Nangtsutu, the set of artistic scrolls they commissioned. We'll get to those later. It notes that Qianlong was the first emperor to see himself as universal ruler in China. He actually tried to appeal to multiple ethnicities and religions. For example, if someone was a Buddhist, he would kind of tie himself into that, tie himself into Confucianism, did whatever he could to appeal to the vast demographic of China. The website cites how important the civil service examination was because it actually led to upward social mobility and allowed low-class commoners to become government workers, which was not something common outside of China at the time. Usually the noble families, the high-class people, were the ones who got the government jobs. The website discusses how the varying economies and geography in China led to local officials who had their own rules and regulations. This was actually an effective way of governing and led to the secret palace memorial system, which was a way that Qing emperors could actually communicate with the local officials without interference. There were notes under lock and key. Actually, the locks and keys came from Europe. Um, the website also talks about how the Europeans had a high demand for Chinese porcelain, and Chinese actually used porcelain as an art canvas at some point. You could see here almost like a porcelain vase, and it's very decorated. The website argues there was no extreme anti-merchant attitudes in Qing China, and this is a new argument. Bentley actually talks about how anti-merchant China was at the time, and how merchants were seen as the lowest of the low. But this website talks about how that's just a common conception, and in fact they weren't that low. They weren't the high-class people, but they weren't shunned either. They also developed the idea of the merchants, saying there was a merchant hierarchy. The merchants who went very far outside of China, or even far within China, as it's a huge land, gained a lot of respect, were high class merchants, whereas those who just kind of stayed locally within a few miles of their homeland, where just the low class merchants didn't have a lot of respect. The Qing was actually also discussed in this website as being laissez faire, and barring a few things like a salt monopoly, they left the economy to the people to run. They just had a couple of small regulations. When you compare the views of these two people, or the website and the person, the Columbia website emphasized the Qing support for art way more than Bentley did. And Bentley also talks about how low class the merchants were and how little respect they had. but the website refutes this claim, not directly to Bentley, just refutes the overall claim of the merchants being that low down. Bentley doesn't point out a merchant hierarchy, but the website actually emphasizes this, talking about how the high-class merchants were those who went far and wide. Bentley discusses how the Manchus tried to keep their cultural identity, as we talked about earlier, with the Manchu-style queue, the marriage ban, etc. But the website doesn't even mention this, or barely does. This is probably because the website wanted to keep their opinion intact about how great the Qing were, and this is actually kind of a blemish if you think about it. How they saw themselves as superior to the Chinese and treated them as inferiors. But, or it's possible they just didn't see this as important enough to cite, that it wasn't as big a deal as Bentley made it sound like. But the big picture is that Bentley saw the Qing as an okay or pretty good dynasty in China, but the website made them out as being spectacular. There's no correct opinion or source, but it's pretty obvious there's a divided opinion here. The Southern Inspection Scrolls were actually very significant, and those were the scrolls we talked about earlier, the Nang Sutu, that were depicted by Qing and Qianlong. They were about, the Southern Inspections themselves were journeys to the south of China to Mount Tai in order to worship the heavens, kind of a religious thing. But most emperors actually only made one trip, if not none, to the Mount Tai. But Emperor Qing made 6 journeys and documented them in the Southern Inspection Scrolls, which were artwork he had commissioned. And following in his grandfather's footsteps, Qianlong also took 6 tours to the Mount Tai, and also commissioned 6 scrolls. The scrolls were actually in a special palace scroll room until the late 19th, early 20th centuries, where they were distributed, and actually I believe 6 of them are now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When you analyze the Southern Inspection Scrolls, there's 4 screenshots over here, all from the Columbia website. The website talks about how this was from the 4th scroll and the first tour of Qianlong, and that it was his attempt to observe flood control. This was actually, a lot of it was made out of sorghum, which is a crop. So it's possible that actually went bad after time, and this led to constant maintenance. But it's possible that a tour like this could lead to the lack of technological growth support. We talked about that earlier. Because if Qianlong saw this, saw how effective it was, he would feel like there's no need to seek better technologies. But that's just my opinion. It's possible there's other reasons for his lack of support for technology. This is from Kangxi's 1689 tour. It's from Mount Tai, from the 3rd scroll. And the website talks about how there's a road that ran along the mountain, and the mountain was huge and hard to navigate. But one can assume, it's kind of sad, that many people probably died either navigating the road and especially laying out the road. Can't be easy to make a road on this huge winding mountain. Also from the 1689 tour, this is from the 7th scroll, and it shows the Oriole Bridge in China, and the Oriole District Bridge, rather. And you could see a lot of people gathering around here. The emperor is probably coming very soon. And it talks about how the emperor was stopped often to sample products. Merchants would try to give him their goods, their food, their hats, etc. And I was thinking it's possible that this was almost like a business venture. If somebody's hat, for example, was worn by the emperor, that could lead to huge things for their business if the locals saw the emperor like their goods, what they were selling. It's also possible this was all sheerly out of respect for the emperor. But for a merchant standpoint, this could have been a business venture to try to get the emperor to endorse their product effectively. This last scroll I have here are a screenshot. These are all just small pictures of a huge scroll. This shows the emperor's entrance into the city. The emperor's entrance into the city of Suzhou is from the 6th scroll. You can only see a couple people in the edge here, but the scroll extends and there's tons of people waiting to see the emperor, who is over here under a gold parasol. And that actually showed his importance. But this almost could be likened to when a president or royalty visits a town. Many people make their way out to see them, not even to speak to them, just to see them. Because it's not often you would see someone of such high importance or royalty or government importance that close to you. So almost like when the English royalty visited America this year, or last year, and they gained a ton of attention. The Qing and the U.S. are actually very much alike, despite the huge time separation and separation in geography. Both have effectively meritocracies. The U.S. politicians must be educated, and them campaigning for their jobs is almost like the civil service rankings. The people who ranked highest in the tests were those who got the best jobs, just like those who did best in their campaigns get the best jobs. The Qing and the founders of the U.S. were both not native to their lands. Many of the early leaders of the U.S. were European, as the early Qing rulers were Manchurian. Eventually, they both identified themselves as where they lived, but that's just what they were when they founded the emperor, when they founded their lands. Both have local officials who report to higher officials. Qing China had the Manchus, and they reported to the emperor. They also had eunuchs. The U.S. has senators, congressmen, governors, and more local officials, and they report to the president or a higher official who also reports higher up. The only big difference is the president didn't have absolute power, whereas the emperor did. China and the U.S. both have varied geographies, which led to also the local government, different levels of production. For example, you're not going to have fishing in Central America. You'd have fishing on the coasts. You'd have agriculture in the breadbasket, as they call it, and so on, similar in China. The early founders of the U.S. and the Qing emperors had strong support of the people. The U.S. still has much strong support of the people. The Qing kind of lost their support later on. But much like Qianlong and Kangxi were well liked, the founding fathers of the U.S. were very well liked. The Dutch were strong European allies of the Qing. They were traded with them, and England is currently and was a strong ally of the U.S. The U.S.-England relationship's a little different. It's not really a trade-based relationship, but the concept of one relatively isolated power having a strong relationship with a European power is similar. The Columbia website talks about how the Qing had a laissez-faire economy, and that's like the modern-day U.S. There's a very hands-off approach. They have regulations, but nothing too strict. But however, unlike the U.S., and I said this earlier, the Qing had one ruler who was clearly the most powerful. The president is probably the most powerful, but the checks and balances system leads to him having to share his power with the legislative and judicial branches of governments. So that's the slideshow. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was informative, and thank you for watching.